This conference is brought to you by CallStack, a total software engineering consultancy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Arushi, and this is my first time at React Universe, and wow, what energy. Thanks to CallStack for making it all happen. So, so earlier in the day, we heard my colleague Alex Hunt talk about the new React Native debugger, which is pretty exciting. And at the keynote, my colleagues Nicola and Ricardo announced the new architecture by default coming in React Native 076. So I am here to tell you about how to get that React Native new architecture to you. But before we get started, a little bit about me. I'm Arushi Kesarwani. I'm from Seattle, and I'm a software engineer in the React team at Meta, where I work on enabling the new architecture both for open source as well as the internal apps at Meta. Today, I want to walk you through the journey of bringing the React Native new architecture, the latest and the greatest, to you. A journey of migrating to the new architecture. We have had a lot of foundational pieces to stabilize and playbooks to help prepare your apps and libraries to the new architecture. We'll be covering the major milestones that we have achieved, and alongside, I want to talk about all the capabilities that you can expect today with the new architecture. I'll show you how migrating to the new architecture is now simpler, faster, and better. But before that, I want to remind you about what is new architecture. So for those of you who don't know, new architecture is essentially a significant rewrite of the React Native internals with a new renderer and a new native module system to make it synchronous so that we can use the concurrent feature in React Native. The term new architecture refers to both the new framework architecture as well as the work it takes to bring it to open source, to you. And today, we are going to expand more on the latter part. But how new is it actually? Fun fact, it was here at React Native EU back in 2018 when my colleague David introduced the new architecture for the first time. And for all these 6 years, the React team at Meta has been making continued improvements over every release, from the runtime capabilities to the Introp Layers. And finally, it's ready for the open source, which is why at React Conf earlier this year in May, we announced the React Native new architecture in beta. But the new architecture isn't just a rewrite, of course. It enables much more capabilities that you can use directly in your application. To know what the new architecture brings to the table, I highly recommend having a look at the React Conf Day 2 keynote by my colleagues Nicola and Ricardo and Katie Kremen from Expo. And let's quickly recap some of those new capabilities. Of course, the biggest advantage of the new architecture is the JSI, the JavaScript interface instead of the bridge. Now, this lifts up the constraints of the legacy architecture and allows for our React Native applications to be synchronous, allows for data sharing much faster and efficient, since there's essentially no queuing without the bridge. With the new architecture, we also have the synchronous access to the layout information, for which I want to quickly spin up an example that Ricardo showed at the React Conf keynote about use layout effect, where we don't need multiple renders in the new architecture, since we now have all the anchor information available to us in the first rendering. So we can render both the views, the tooltip as well as the red box, in the first at the same time, actually. Now, the new architecture also supports concurrent rendering and features that have shipped in React 18 and beyond. You can now use features like suspense for data fetching, transitions, and other new React APIs in your React Native code itself. The concurrent renderer also brings some of the out-of-the-box improvements like automatic batching, which reduces the re-renders in the React. For instance, in this example, the slider actually specifies how many tiles you want to render. Now, dragging that slider from 0 to 1,000, you can see will fire off a quick succession of state updates and re-renders. Now, in comparing the renderers of the same code, you can visually notice that the renderer with the new architecture provides a smoother UI with less intermediate UI updates. Now, the state updates from the native event handlers, like this native slider component, are now batched, which is the advantage that you get with the new architecture. Now that we have looked at the new architecture capabilities, let's also talk about what it takes to roll out these capabilities, the new architecture, to you, to everyone across the ecosystem. But it's hard to change the engine while flying the plane, right? Especially if your plane is the React Native ecosystem with thousands of libraries and millions of developers out there. Rolling out the new architecture is like upgrading that engine mid-flight. And this is what we have been focusing on over the past few years. So let's review the timeline for the last few years, what it has been for us. So much has changed for the new architecture from 0.68 till today, especially with the recent releases, making it easy to adopt the new architecture. So I want to take you on the journey from introducing the new architecture to enabling the new architecture for everyone. We started small from internal in 2018 to first opening the usage of the new architecture in React Native 0.68 a couple of years ago. And at that time, it was in an experimental phase and behind an opt-in flag. Now, once folks started trying it out, we got the feedback, that migrating to the new architecture is whether you are like developing a library or an app developer, it takes a lot of time and effort and a lot of code changes. So we gradually introduced improvements to the new architecture so as to make it easier for you to adopt, like a C++ less template, or by adding the Introp Layers that let you actually use some of the APIs that you were using in the legacy architecture in the new one. In 0.78, we laid out the foundation of these Introp Layers and started building it out for the legacy components. Similarly, in 0.73, we introduced Bridgeless to get the runtime up and ready and built on top of those existing Introp Layers for the native modules and the native view configs. Now, as you can see, over time, we have been building the various pieces of the new architecture. In 0.68, we got the renderer. In 73, we got the runtime ready. But the ecosystem was not yet ready. And as you saw in today's keynote by Nicola and Ricardo, that 2024 for us was all about getting that ecosystem up and ready. So now that the Introp Layers had matured enough, in 0.74, we made this new renderer Introp layer automatic and added backwards compatibility by bringing back some of those APIs that you were using in the legacy architecture to the new architecture so that you can start adopting the new architecture, which allowed us to confidently make Bridgeless the default. In 0.75, we focused on the new architecture stabilization, migrated those libraries to the new architecture and the ecosystem to par with the new architecture. And yes, in 0.76, as you saw in today's keynote, new architecture will be the default now that the ecosystem is ready. Let's take a closer look at these Introp layers and understand their role in getting us over here. So, in our React Native apps, we have these existing legacy native components, native modules that need to be compatible with the new architecture. So, how do we achieve this? The Introp layers actually make it possible to use the existing native modules, components, and view configs written for the legacy architecture with the new architecture. And it's important to note that these are completely transparent to the developers. They have been a strategy for migration and bridge the gap between the legacy architecture and the new one. Now these interop layers, they work on all parts of new architecture, whether it's the native module layer, native components layer, or also on the app integration layer. The new rendered interop layer is effectively a wrapper, just like a platform layer, that allows you to register those legacy components into the new renderer. And it maps the legacy function invocation to the equivalent in the new renderer. Similarly, the native modules interop layer, most legacy modules registered with React Native will be supported by the new native module system. We introduced this new rendered interop layers in 0.72, and similarly, we introduced these native module interop layers and the native view config interop layers in 0.73. And then in 0.74, we made this new rendered interop layer automatic. Aside from these interop layers, backporting those APIs that were working in the old architecture to the new architecture was solely possible through backwards compatibility, which we have emphasized over the recent release of 0.74 to minimize the breaking changes. Now, bringing back some of the APIs that you were using earlier to the new architecture so that it's easier for you to start adopting the new architecture. Now, one example I want to show for this backported API is get catalyst instance. Catalyst instance is a higher level API on top of the asynchronous JSC bridge that provides an environment for you to allow the invocation of JavaScript methods. Now, since the new architecture is bridgeless and there's no bridge or catalyst instance anymore, now, to maintain backwards compatibility, we have backported this getCatalyst instance to return a proxy bridgeless catalyst instance. Now, this proxy also supports methods like getChaos, call invoker holder, runtime executor, and so that it ensures that the existing functionality can still work smoothly without requiring any more breaking changes. But the true power of React Native lies in its community, the community that you guys have built over all of these years. So now that we talked about the interop layers and backwards compatibility, how can you take advantage of this? As Keith from Expo rightly said at the Chain React panel session, it takes an entire village to build React Native. Thanks for all of your contributions, like reporting all those issues, fixing libraries. We are today able to get React Native new architecture in this state. And that gets me to the coolest part about the React Native ecosystem, the libraries. The libraries built by our community members and our partners. Now, these third-party libraries, let me just tell you, they're really awesome and absolutely loved by the community. They're the building blocks of our ecosystem. They not only enrich the React Native applications and are heavily used, but they're also a testament, of what you can build today with React Native. And they're the foundation of the open source ecosystem. And our ecosystem includes thousands of libraries like this, which is why migrating each of them to the new architecture at this scale was challenging. And that's why I want to deep dive a little bit into how we made these libraries new architecture compatible. Now, to make the transition to new architecture smoother, we talked about how we enhanced the interop layers to cover bridgeless. But we also worked with several partners like Expo, CallStack, Software Mansion, and other independent library maintainers to make sure that these libraries, they'll work with bridgeless from day one. And thanks to Expo for driving all of this effort. Now, libraries, these third-party libraries, have a different way of being compatible with the new architecture. So some of those libraries, they just worked out of the box. They're mostly pure JS libraries that are simple to adopt to the new architecture. whereas the other libraries, they have been fully updated to support the new architecture, thereby achieving migrated compatibility. And then there are these some other libraries that can achieve this via the Introp layers. Let me give you some examples of them. So these libraries, React Native Keychain, Vector Icons, Get Random Values, these are the examples of immediately compatible libraries with the new architecture. Similarly, the vast majority of the Expo modules just worked out of the box once we added support for them in the Expo modules core. Now, kudos to Expo for their work on SDK and making sure that all these Expo modules work with the new architecture. Yeah. So these are the examples of the libraries that have been migrated to the new architecture. And we are really grateful to the early adopters who actually migrated their libraries. They not only helped us identify issues with the new architecture, but they also fixed some of those in the process. For example, these libraries by Software Mansion, React Native Reanimated, Screens, Gesture Handler. I want to shout out to Software Mansion who helped contributing to the core, ironing out more than 20 bugs and edge cases to make sure that new architecture works smoothly for everyone, for you guys. And with support from Expo, we have also updated our guides on migrating a library to the new architecture. So I highly recommend go check that out. And then we had these special libraries that worked with the Introp. Now, since migrating was challenging for us, we are committed to making it easier for you, which means there's like a lot of hidden things you would need not know via the Introp, which is essentially our migration strategy for the new architecture. These are libraries like React Native Maps, React Native Device Info, and React Native ViewShot. Now let's take a closer look at one of those, React Native ViewShot. So React Native ViewShot is a pretty cool library that actually lets you take a snapshot of a React Native view at any given point of time and save it as an image. Now, while migrating React Native ViewShot to the new renderer, we were getting multiple reports of like, yeah, the React tag is not working with the new architecture, or how the view was not getting rendered. Now, thanks to the community for all these reports and identifying those issues, we were able to get this working while we migrated it to use the Introp layers. Now, in the process, we also improved the Introp layers in the core by fixing, for example, in Android, we fixed the Introp UI block listener, and in iOS, we fixed the add UI block dictionary, which led us to eventually add up the support for new architecture in the library. Shout out to the maintainer of React Native ViewShot, Ketan Renendu, for all the reviews and testing on this. Now, this also led us to backport some of the APIs that we built, like UI Manager, and build the support for migrating the UI Manager module to an equivalent in the new architecture, thereby achieving backwards compatibility, as we have now been more and more mindful of the breaking changes. Now, this example of React Native ViewShot shows us how, starting from a library, we can really improve the React Native core for everyone and make sure that more and more libraries just work out of the box now. Now, with this, we have got majority of the libraries new architecture compatible. Together with Expo, we worked with various partners like Software Mansion, CallStack to test out their libraries and further improve the core. And with help from the community, we have done the migration. So you don't have to do that. And today, in the ecosystem, we have more than thousands of libraries. And some of them are sadly unmaintained, which is why, together with folks at Expo, to help you understand which of these libraries are compatible with the new architecture, We reworked the React Native directory website on adding the new architecture label, as well as a way to filter them so that it's immediately clear for you if a library already supports the new architecture or not. And with that, I'm proud to announce that we have got more than 835 libraries and still counting new architecture enabled. But the new architecture isn't just about library migration, right? As Nicola mentioned earlier today in the keynote, another reason why you should really start adopting the new architecture is because the new features that partners and us are working might be only new architecture. And you'd miss out on those if you're not on the new architecture. That's the whole reason we are so pushing on the new architecture now. One such pretty cool new architecture-only feature is the percentage support that my colleagues Olga and Naman introduced at their React Conf talk, the next decade of React Native. With the 0.75 release, one highly requested feature for yoga was the percentage support at various places, in addition to the points, like gap, column gap, row gap. They now support string with a percentage value, including the border radius. Similarly, the transform prop, that can also now accept string as values for the translate transformations. And again, these are only available to you in the new architecture. Similarly, in 74, we added support for the position static, which allows you to absolutely position an element, not just with respect to the direct parent. For example, you can notice how this green view declares the left and the top, and it is positioned relative to the blue view, and not just to its relative to its parent. So now these new architecture exclusive features, they're not only limited to us or to React Native, they also extend to popular libraries like Reanimated. Now, as many of you know, React Native Reanimated is a powerful animation library built by Software Mansion. With Reanimated, you can easily create those smooth animations and interactions that run on the UI thread. And the latest Reanimated is exclusively compatible with the new architecture. So, to conclude, I hope I have shown you today by leveraging those Introp layers and the ecosystem around you, migrating your apps and libraries to the new architecture is indeed simpler, faster, and better. And the new architecture also unlocks exclusive features, so if you're eager to leverage them, consider making the switch now. The new architecture is here and the default with React Native 0.76, which is coming in few weeks. And with all of these improvements that we talked about today, I'm really excited where React Native is today with the new architecture. I feel like it's never been a better time to be a React Native developer. And we can't wait to bring those new capabilities on top of the new architecture. So I encourage you to enable the new architecture now. We also invite you to take part in the new architecture survey. The survey is key for us to collect feedback on the next steps for the new architecture rollout, since the future for React Native is the new architecture. It's been an honor to walk you through this journey of new architecture. And my name is Arushi Kesarwani. You can reach me out on GitHub or Twitter. And I'll still be around to answer your questions if you have any. And thank you so much for listening to me patiently. And thank you so much for having me.
Give it up for Arushi.